good day. And before I start this program, let me again remind you to tick the like button if once you've watched the video or whatever part of the video you want to watch, you've liked what you've heard and you want to indicate that fact. Now, today I'm going to start with news that's coming from Belgium, from Euroclear, the famous European depository where a large proportion of the Russian central bank's frozen reserves are located. And over the last few hours, the last 24 hours, the chief executive officer of Euroclear, Valery Ulb, has made a number of statements which make clear, for me at least, where the objections from the Belgian government against the European plan for a loan treating Russian assets in euro. Clear as collateral where those objections within Belgium are coming from. So Valery Ulb has made a number of comments, and I'm going to summarize them as follows. Firstly, misappropriating the Russian assets in Euroclear would effectively amount to theft. Secondly, doing such a thing would be inconceivable and unthinkable and would in effect be illegal. Thirdly, that Euroclear is extremely alarmed about the effect on its own reputation if any such step were made. Fourthly, that Euroclear has already been contacted by clients from around the world. She mentioned Asia and the Middle East, all of them anxious about the discussions concerning the potential seizure or confiscation or misappropriation of the Russian central bank's frozen assets, and Euroclear has been trying to reassure them. And lastly, that Euroclear not only opposes such steps, but is considering legal action in the event that the European Commission and European governments were to decide to take this step of confiscating, misappropriating, doing various illegal things with the Russian frozen assets, which Euroclear considers to be both illegal and disastrous. So it does not automatically follow that Euroclear would comply with an instruction to have the assets misappropriated in the way that has been suggested and which might be done. These are pretty strong words, and I would just add something else. I saw a commentary about Valery's words in which it mentioned that the total amount of the funds deposited in Euroclear, not by the Russians, but by all the various depositors, the central banks and other agencies that deposit funds in Euroclear, that the total amount of these amounts to something like 40 trillion euro. The 200 billion euros of frozen Russian assets is a minuscule part of the amount in total on deposit. The point is that if the holders of these funds were to start to worry that Euroclear itself was unsafe and start to withdraw their assets and funds from Euroclear, well, given that we're talking about $40 trillion or euros of deposits, one could see how that could have a catastrophic impact on the EU's entire economy, given that I suspect that that figure of 40 trillion exceeds significantly the total amount of Europe's GDP. Just saying. Now, in saying that, one must make a number of immediate qualifications. Firstly, I don't know that this figure of 40 trillion euros is actually true. That's the first thing to say, but I suspect it probably is. It feels to me as if it could be. Secondly, it is likely that a large proportion of that 40 trillion, perhaps the bulk of it, is made up of funds and assets deposited with Euroclear by Western financial institutions, Western central banks, Western public institutions and companies, perhaps for all I know, international institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. I don't know for a fact that they have funds with Euroclear, but I would not be surprised if they did. And more likely than not, if there was some misappropriation of Russian funds, well, all of that money, which I am guessing accounts for the greater part of the money and assets on deposit with Euroclear, would stay put. But if there was a significant withdrawal of funds, say 1 or 2 trillion euros, seems astonishing to talk about that from Euroclear, that would create a crisis and a cascade effect on the whole system. I'm not saying categorically that it would, but I can see by Valery Urban and the government of Belgium, which clearly would not have the resources to stabilize Euroclear. We're talking about an institution far bigger in terms of its financial reach than the government of Belgium. I can very well understand why they would be so nervous with what is being proposed. And given also how big Euroclear is, it becomes entirely understandable why the governments of the other European states are very, very wary of taking any step at all that might be seen to be giving Euroclear a backstop, going beyond the backstop that the Belgian government would be obliged to provide. So that is an interesting development. Now, in any normal world, in any rational world, that would be the end of the matter, but of course it won't be. The European Commission continues obsessively to seek ways of using these frozen Russian assets in order to try to fund Ukraine. I am going to say this. I come to the view, in light of what Valery Urban is saying, that the capital of the Russian central bank's funds held in Euroclear is indeed intact, and that what the European governments have been working with has indeed been the interest produced by those assets in Euroclear. Now, however, as my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou has rightly pointed out, the amount of interest that the assets in Euroclear are generating is not enough to cover all of the financial obligations that it seems to me have already been made on the strength of the interest that these assets have supposedly been generating. So I'm going to make a guess that what has been happening is that quietly European governments and the European Commission have been quietly appropriating various frozen Russian assets that have been lying around in Europe outside Euroclear and which have not been protected by Euroclear in the same way. So by now, I suspect that what has happened is that the European Commission and European governments have run through all of these assets. Some say I've seen a figure of 80 billion euros in assets, Russian frozen assets, mostly government assets, but also quite plausibly some assets of some private individuals as well, that European governments and the European Commission have quietly already used up all of those, and that is how the figures have been squared. But that so far it has indeed been the case that they have not dared up to now to touch the capital in Euroclear. Now, with all of the frozen Russian assets lying around Europe, which were not in Euroclear, already used up, and the interest that the Euroclear assets are generating no longer sufficient, this is why the European Commission and some European governments, including the German government, have started to look at the remaining Russian assets in Euroclear, and this is the precipitating event in this crisis. Now, the alternative, as the European Commission says, given that funding from the EU budget for Ukraine is apparently no longer possible, would be for European governments themselves to increase the level of funding for Ukraine beyond what they have already been doing. Germany, Friedrich Merz's government, has already done that to the tune of 3 billion euros for next year, but that, of course, will be nowhere close to being enough. The other European governments, for the moment, are balking at doing so. And even in terms of the German government, that is, in effect, a rounding error. 3 billion additional euros is not going to come anywhere close to meeting the financial needs of Ukraine, which is spending more through its budget, more than, as I understand it, twice the amount it receives in taxes from whatever part of the economy continues to function and whose financial needs continue to grow and swell as its deficit continues to grow and swell. So we can begin to see the extent of the crisis. Now, before saying a few more things about where this leaves the crisis in Ukraine, I want to say something here about Valery Urban. I've seen a narrative that has begun to take shape, which says that the leaders of Europe, people like Starmer in London, Ursula von der Leyen in the European Commission, presumably Friedrich Merz and Emmanuel Macron in Germany and France, that they're not really politicians at all, but technocrats. And there's actually an article in Unheard by Eris Rusinos who refers to Starmer as the last of the technocrats. I don't think that any of these people can be described properly as technocrats. Technocrats are the indispensable experts, the people who have the technical knowledge, who are found within all important governments and public institutions, who know how to make things work and who know how to pull the levers to get things done. Mostly, in many places, they are engineers. In financial institutions, they are financial experts. Valery Urban is a technocrat. Ursula von der Leyen, Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron, Friedrich Merz are not. These people are better described as functionaries, members of the European political apparatus, and they absolutely lack the kind of technical competence and understanding of the mechanics that someone like Valery Urban has, which is why they come up with these mad schemes like the attempts to mismanage the Russian assets in the way that they do. Anyway, that is one thing I want to say. There is another thing I want to say, which is about the way in which the financial crisis, the funding crisis for Ukraine, probably is already impacting on the situation in Kyiv itself. Now, there's been a lot of speculation about the motivations behind the current corruption crisis in Kyiv. The former Ukrainian Prime Minister Nikolai Azarov, who worked as Prime Minister of Ukraine successfully during the time of President Yanukovych and who is now in exile in Russia, has seen the corruption scandal that is playing out in Kyiv as part of an attempt by the United States to remove Vladimir Zelensky from the scene. The Americans have become increasingly frustrated by Zelensky's total intransigence. The meeting between Donald Trump and Zelensky that took place in October, the meeting which took place directly after Trump's long telephone call with Putin, the telephone call in which Putin warned him against deploying Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine, and over the course of which Trump offered and suggested a summit meeting between himself and Putin in Budapest. Anyway, that meeting between Zelensky and Trump was supposedly the final straw. And in fact, I'm now hearing reports both from Russian and American sources, and I want to be very careful what I say here, but I'm hearing reports that the meeting between Trump and Zelensky went horribly wrong and not according to plan, in the sense that after the telephone conversation between Trump and Putin, there was an understanding on the part of some officials within the U.S. government that Trump would speak with Zelensky and would tell Zelensky that the end point in the conflict had been reached, that it was time to move forward with the understanding that Trump and Putin had reached at the summit in Anchorage, and that the Americans wanted Ukraine to accept the Russian conditions, to accept Istanbul Plus, and in return to get a temporary ceasefire in Zaporizhia and Kherson region, but to pull out from Donbass. And then apparently, to the surprise of some officials, both in Washington and Moscow, over the course of a tense and acrimonious discussion between Trump and Zelensky, it became clear to Trump that Zelensky was immovable. And to the dismay and astonishment of some officials, it was Trump rather than Zelensky who at that point backed down. That was the final moment when Trump went back on his agreement with Putin, the agreement he reached at Anchorage, and went over entirely to Zelensky's position that instead there should be a ceasefire on the existing conflict lines, and only then should negotiations of any sort begin, and that there should be, in effect, a freeze of the conflict, as urged by General Kellogg, Marco Rubio, and all the others. And the American decision to call off the summit meeting between Putin and Trump in Budapest was because the Americans did not know how to explain to Putin in person the extent of the U-turn that Trump had made over the course of his conversation with Zelensky. Now, I want to stress I wasn't present at that conversation. I don't know that this is really so. Zelensky has spoken as if it was so, and of course, Trump has, in effect, confirmed this. The Russians are, as I've discussed many times, furious about the whole affair. Yuri Ushakov, Putin's foreign policy aide, has been talking about this again today. He says that the Ukrainians know perfectly well what Putin and Trump agreed with each other in Anchorage, and so do European governments, that it was all communicated to them, and the Russians know that for a fact. Again, I don't know what information Ushakov has. I'm not going to speculate. But anyway, the argument that essentially people like Azarov are making is that the Americans are now basically reconsidering the position all over again. And that after the sudden deterioration of the situation on the battlefronts, understanding that the narrative about the war being in stalemate, that they were sold, or that Trump was sold by Zelensky and his American allies, was wrong. The Americans have decided that the moment has come to deal with Zelensky, to get him out of the way, to try to find another Ukrainian leader who will take his place, so that the understanding between Putin and Trump reached in Anchorage can be finally put back on track. And that this explains the sudden activation of the corruption investigation in Kiev, that NABU and SAPO, which were set up by the United States and supposedly under American control, were activated and brought these corruption allegations precisely with the intention of undermining Zelensky himself and of causing a change in the regime in Kiev, bringing someone else into place who can then lead Ukraine along the path that Trump has outlined towards agreeing to Istanbul Plus. I've set this out in detail because I get the sense that this is becoming a widespread view, and now that Azarov has expressed it, I'm going to guess that it's becoming even more widespread. It is often discussed on the Russian part of the internet, and I believe also on the Ukrainian side of the internet as well. I don't myself believe this. I think that these investigations, the corruption investigations in Kyiv, have a long backstory. They probably go back at least to early summer, well before the Anchorage summit. I believe, moreover, that Nabu and Sapo, even though they might have been originally set up by the United States, are today more under European influence than American influence. And I already expressed my view that I think it would still be an enormously complicated operation to oust Zelensky. He still has the support of the security forces, the SBU, and others, and probably he also has the support of the various nationalist brigades. And besides, I don't believe that either the Americans or the leaders of the political class in Kyiv want to risk destabilization of Ukraine that Zelensky's ouster might cause. And I also don't believe that there's any political figure in Kiev who, if placed in Zelensky's post, would not continue the same policies. But what I do think is highly likely is that these investigations launched against corrupt members of Zelensky's circle are connected with the financial crisis, the funding crisis for Ukraine that is currently playing out in Europe. Um, there is a growing sense in Ukraine and amongst Ukraine's European backers that the money flow is about to reduce. It will never entirely stop. There is therefore some need to streamline the operation. There is also some need to put in place new people who perhaps feel that it's time that they had their share or their cut. And the corruption crisis in Kyiv is indeed connected strongly with the crisis that is currently playing out in Brussels as the European Union and European governments struggle to come up with sources of funding. Anyway, that's what I think. This is an important story, one that should not be overlooked. I go back to what Alex Christoforou has pointed out, that Project Ukraine, the project launched by the neocons and their European allies, always had about it a major quality of a grift. And interruptions or adjustments to the funding supply will inevitably reflect themselves in some of the public expressions of that grift. And that is precisely what we're now seeing in Kyiv. Now, since I've mentioned Donald Trump, I think I want to say a few more things about where he stands at the moment. Because over the last 36 hours, he has had what I can only describe as a kind of meltdown. He's turning on people who used to be in the United States, his staunchest, his loyalist supporters, the same people who enabled him ultimately to win his various political and legal battles during his years in the wilderness after the 2020 election, and who were instrumental in bringing him back to the presidency again. He has written astonishing comments about Marjorie Taylor Greene and Representative Thomas Massie. He has also been increasingly critical, and indeed abusively critical, of Tucker Carlson. He said extraordinary things about Senator Rand Paul. He is obviously becoming increasingly isolated and seems to be taking steps to make himself more isolated still. And there is no doubt that the approximate cause of this, and in fact, a large part of the cause, is indeed the controversy over the Epstein files, which he currently refers to as a hoax, which is going to upset and alarm his supporters even more. If it really is a hoax, which I should make clear, I don't for a moment think then perhaps Trump himself ought to remember that it is a hoax that he himself gave life to, because it was he who repeatedly promised before the election that he would make full disclosure of the entire document file. Anyway, I'm not going to discuss that aspect. But again, I get the sense that we are drifting into some kind of conflict in Venezuela. Yesterday, or maybe the day before, the War Secretary, Pete Hegseth, spoke about how the U.S. military is about to launch some kind of grand anti-drugs operation. It was even given its own name, which I've forgotten. All of which looks clear to me as indicating some kind of attack on Venezuela. We've had Trump's own comments about this. We've had Trump's reversal of his agreement in Anchorage with Putin. And now we see Trump turning on the most loyal and staunch part of his base, who are now disillusioned and distancing themselves from him. I have to say this, with Trump, one can never be completely sure. He has had an extraordinary ability to come to the point of total self-destruction and then find his way back. But this time, the level of self-destruction is so great that I cannot see how he can find his way back. And going back to the speculation that there is some plan underway now to remove Zelensky, to bring someone in place who can then act upon the understanding that Trump and Putin achieved in Anchorage, it seems to me that apart from the difficulties of conducting such an operation in Kyiv, I don't believe that Trump any longer has the political capital or the authority in Washington to carry out an operation of that kind, or the control of people on the ground in Nabu and Sapo and in the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv and in the bureaucracy in Washington to achieve that. Just saying. So, anyway, I've discussed this at length, but I think that this is in some respects as important a story as the military developments themselves are. And it is to these that I will now turn because we've had more dramatic news. Every day brings dramatic news, but more dramatic news over the last 24 hours. And I am going to start today with the situation in Zaporizhia region because the Russian Defense Ministry has now said that units of the Dnieper Group forces completed the liberation of Malaya Tokmachka in Zaporizhia region. Malaya Tokmachka is located southeast of the important town of Orakov. When the Russian Defense Ministry says this village has been captured, one of the villages used as a launching pad for Ukraine's disastrous summer 2023 offensive. This is important. When they say that the entirety of the village has been captured, I assume they also refer to the prison complex south of the village, which was a major fortified position the Ukrainians created. So that positions the Russians closer to Orakov. If you look at a map, you can see Malaya Tokmachka is close, and this places the Russians in positions east of Orakov, well positioned to unite with forces advancing from the east, the forces that will soon likely conduct an attack on Guliapol. Now, there's been a lot of news around Guliapol. It's not an exaggeration to talk about a collapse of Ukrainian troops in this area. Reports say more villages east of Guliapol are falling one after another. Yesterday, the Russians confirmed they captured Yablikovo. This morning, they confirmed Rivnopol. If you now look at a map of Guliapol, what you see is the situation resembles that famous wave painting by Hokusai. The Russians south, east, and north of Guliapol are about to crash from multiple directions. I mentioned yesterday that reports say the Ukrainians are evacuating civilians from Guliapol. There was a report this morning, although unreliable, that the Ukrainian military now considers abandoning the town itself. I don't believe that, but the accelerating collapse makes it understandable. Let me go back to Malaya Tokmachka. Control of Malaya Tokmachka puts the Russians in a position to advance northwards, cutting the main supply road to Guliapol from the west. The Russians already cut the northern supply road. If they cut the western one too, then Guliapol would be encircled. Perhaps this explains the capture of Malaya Tokmachka. Maybe the reports that Ukrainians understand Guliapol is lost contain some truth. Further north, the Russians are attacking Andreevka and are closing in on Pokrovsk region villages. Ukrainians complain bitterly about collapses of defenses near Dnipro, Pavlograd, and so on. It increasingly looks like the Russian advance westward to the river and possibly the cities of Pavlograd, Dnipro, and Zaporizhia is becoming unstoppable. This would be catastrophic. Ukraine would no longer be viable, and there is no real sign Ukrainians can stop this. The Russian Defense Ministry says more about other fronts. Pokrovsk, Mirnograd, describing Russian assaults, mopping up Ukrainian formations, repelling attempts by the 425th Skala Assault Regiment to break encirclements. There's video of fighting. The Russians say all attempts were unsuccessful. They say units of the 155th Mechanized Brigade attempted to break out but were thwarted. The ring around Pokrovsk remains firm. There are reports that General Syrskyi has transferred more troops to Pokrovsk, 10,000 supposedly, though I doubt that number. Russians are reportedly close to Hrodivka and even Hryshny itself. There's also footage of Russian bombing of Belozersky, an absolute lunar landscape likely to fall soon as Russians finish with Pokrovsk and Mirnograd. Russian MOD says in Mirnograd, units continue to advance and assault detachments approach Zapadny district. For the first time in a long time, Russians give numbers, 33 buildings liberated. This suggests the Russians have been given the green light to complete the mopping up operation. We are at the brink of the end. There's a new narrative in Western media. The fog caused the Russian breakthrough. They blame fog because their chronology is false. Russians made their breakthrough deep into Pokrovsk in August when There was no fog. People still believe everything Ukrainians say must be true and everything Russians say must be false. Anyway, the fog may play a role, but it's not the reason Russia is winning. Russians also say in Kupiansk, assault detachments continued to eliminate encircled Ukrainian formations. 2 attacks launched by Ukrainian brigades to release encircled troops were repelled. Claims say Syrskyi deployed 10,000 men to Kupiansk, 10,000 to Pokrovsk, 10,000 to Pavlograd. Impossible. Likely he deployed 10,000 to only